So this is just a really high level sort of summary of our approach to building the data request for CMIP7. We have kind of compartmentalized three components of the data request for CMIP7. A core component, which is going to be a baseline set of variables that will be requested from every simulation, from every model. It's about 130, I think, variables that really just summarizes that, the core analysis and benchmarking and baseline sort of analysis that gets done. On top of that, we'll be building the harmonized data request. By harmonized, what we really mean is a set of variables that facilitates and that feeds into as many of the science objectives that we need to, while keeping that list as small as possible. We don't want one MIP requesting temperature on 15 pressure levels and another on 19 pressure levels. That's a duplication that's not necessarily. So an example of this would be agreeing on a set of pressure levels for that variable to be saved on. That harmonized layer of the data request is really what the key of what we're working onto at the moment. The core set of the baseline variables at the top has already been defined, and it's just being finalized now through an open process, but that's been going for quite a long time. This harmonized process is we're really spinning this up on quite a short time frame, and the primary aim for it is for the AR7 fast track experiments. That's the primary goal. That's the timeline we're working on. But there'll be an interest in exploring sort of slightly outside of that as well to make sure that those who don't have experiments in the fast track are also serviced as well. The third layer on this is the unharmonized component. It's a little bit conceptual at the moment, and we don't really know exactly how it's going to connect technologically wise into the rest of the fast track, but it's going to be sort of the rolling part of this. The fast track is either underway or done. New MIPS are spinning up, new experiments are being generated. How can we allow MIPS to be able to request data from those experiments without going through the full harmonized process, which we're doing at the moment. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Let's move on. I forgot that I put the slide in. So that harmonized layer in the middle is really the primary part of what we're talking about here. And that's what the thematic author teams will be defining here, this middle section. Let's keep going. So some of the main changes from CMIP6, there's been a lot of changes for CMIP7 from CMIP6, as I'm sure you all know. There's no endorsement process of MIPS anymore. The fast track, the limited set of experiments that have been defined under the fast track are what sort of CMIP is officially supporting at this time, with community MIPS sort of gathering around that, and we want to support that as much as possible in the data request, but we also have to work to this time frame and make sure that this fast track is our highest priority. These thematic papers, which I will describe in a little bit more detail later, they're really here to establish this clear understanding of what data we need and what it's going to be used for, why is it needed. So we're talking variable definitions. A lot of that will be based off what we did in CMIP6, but we're trying to raise sort of transparency over what is actually request, what does a high priority variable really mean, and do we know why a variable is there in the request, and trying to increase the transparency of what we expect that variable used by and what kind of analysis for. We're going to be doing this by mapping against variables against experiments through the idea of an opportunity. So an opportunity of certain types of analysis. That opportunity might be dynamical downscaling. What variables do we need to sort of facilitate those analysis and use opportunities, data use opportunities? We're going to be engaging with modeling centers through this thematic process. In CMIP6, each MIP really sort of gave a long list of requirements to the CMIP process, to Martin largely in CMIP6, who acted as that go-between between the MIPS and the modeling centers. We want to facilitate more open discussions between the MIPS and the modeling centers about what the priorities are and how to keep a data request within the scope that resourcing can still be adequately deployed to it. Looking to simplify the data request structure as much as possible, still have it function the way that we need it to have, but try and trim back a little bit of the excess to try and again increase that transparency of what we're doing, so that people really understand why variables appear in the data request the way that they do. We're also got a very tight short time frame. It's called fast track for a reason. We're working pretty hard to spin up these thematic papers at the moment. It's going to be a pretty tight time frame. We're hoping to get out sort of an initial beta by sort of September, October kind of time. I'll talk about the timeline later. So we're looking at pretty short time frames here. Let's keep powering on. This is really kind of a bit of a summary of what I've already mentioned, but there's two primary tensions here that we've been battling with in the data request, and these thematic processes have largely come out of an attempt to resolve these tensions. One of them is the balance between the scientific need for variables, for a large amount of variables to do different types of analysis, even new variables for CMIP7, and balancing that with the resource restrictions of modeling centers. We're talking both data volumes as well as the human resources needing to actually encode all of the variables. As someone who sat there for a year straight just encoding CMIP6 variables into our analysis pipeline, it can be hard to do 3,000 of them. And so really getting an idea of what modeling centers see as a reasonable number of variables and trying to fit in the sort of satisfy the scientific objectives within those resourcing restrictions. The second tension is really about the timing. In CMIP6, there were a number of updates, and we learned a lot from looking back at the CMIP6 process. There's kind of a balance between wanting to have an early and stable release so that modeling centers have enough time to integrate that well into their simulation and data processing pipelines. But on the other hand, the balance is having enough time for the MIPS to actually develop the requirements to get a good harmonized data request and not trying to rush through to get a final thing that maybe has a level of duplication that we're not happy with. So managing sort of those expectations. Let's continue. So when it comes to how you might want to contribute, and then I'll be going into some more detail about this stuff later. This is kind of just to flag nice and early with you. The first step is going to be we've got an initial contact author teams form that can be used currently if you want to contact the author team specifically, and I'll be talking about what they are and what their scopes will look like. So that's our sort of initial contact point so that we can get some early engagement with people who are ready to start going, we're this MIP and we have this, we want to engage with this way nice and early, and that's great. As we develop further, we're going to be looking at putting out some surveys from the data request representing the thematic author teams, some surveys, some early ideas of what the data request will look like and the schema, some examples around opportunities and variable groups that I'm going to talk about in a bit. So please, if you're not already, sign up to the CMIP mailing list. It'll all go out through there, all those communications. So there's going to be a lot of community consultation happening in the next few months. As part of that, over sort of between July and September, will be some open meetings as well, feedbacks, and trying to update on where the author teams are at, sort of an update to this process. So that's just at a high level what you're looking at for how to contribute and what timeline you're on to contribute as well. I'm going to talk a bit about the actual thematic author process, which I've mentioned several times, but you might not know what it is. What we've done, we're spinning up 5 author teams in order to define a set of variables in under various themes. They're loosely domains, modeling domains, but we didn't want to be restricted to modeling domains because it didn't cover everything that CMIP is asked for and is used for. We've got 5, so we've got impacts and adaptation. That author group is well underway. They've been meeting for at least a month or two as a full author team, and they've done a lot of thinking. We wanted to set that one up early because on one we wanted to kind of test our process without on a single author team. And they also had quite a lot to work through. It's a bit of a less defined than the other thematic author teams around MIPS because it's not really MIP focused. We're sort of coordinating with Cordex and Viax AB and groups like that and trying to understand the scope of what falls into this impact and adaptation bucket. It's something that maybe hasn't really been deeply considered when it comes to supplying CMIP data. And so that's a big sort of a new extension of the data request for this time. We're wanting to prioritize including impacts and adaptation use cases. The other four that are currently forming now, so the steering groups are currently being set up with author selections taking place currently. The author selection process, the author application process has already been done for these four. So we've got atmosphere, land and land ice, ocean and sea ice, and the Earth system. And by the Earth system, we're really talking about those aspects that are teleconnections, probably coupling aspects as well, sort of variable transition between different domains, and trying to capture that not everything falls within a domain aspect here. So those are the 5 groups that we're spinning up. Authors and reviewers have already been recruited, so we've already got full names. Like I said, the impacts and adaptation one is well and truly going at the moment, and the other ones are currently working, the steering committees are working through getting set up and working through those applications. The author teams will conduct consultation with the relevant communities. What the really big, the big ticket item for these thematic paper author teams is as a connection point between the data request and the broad community, so that each MIP doesn't necessarily have to generate an entire paper to submit these requests, but we also get a way of consolidating them effectively and to have as much reach as possible. 5 author teams are able to have a much wider reach and a much more representative idea of what is needed than a very small group of people or even just a couple of people. What we're going to be asking these author themes to do is to define what data they're requesting for under their theme. This is going to be some technical aspects to this, defining CF standard names and the metadata that goes with that so that CMIP is as aligned with CF as possible. We want to know why is that data needed, who's going to be using it, and how will it be used. That really comes down to these opportunities that I mentioned before. Who's going to be using this data for what purpose, what kind of analysis pipelines, for what type of impacts or policy decision makings might you be doing these analysis for, to really get an idea of the full chain of data usage past just the MIPS themselves, but all the way out to final users as well. We're going to be asking each team to start with the CMIP6 data request. The data request is extremely full of information. There's a lot of variables there. There's 3,000 variables in there. And we're going to start with that as a starting point. We're going to look at variables and the variable use and publication statistics from CMIP6 to understand who provided what variables were not prioritized by modeling centers, what variables were submitted but not used very much, and then filling in any gaps that we have to cover emerging areas or new modeling capability. This might be ice sheets, this might be fire, weather, and that kind of thing. We're looking to aim in the ballpark of 1,000 harmonized variables, so really cutting down to maybe half to a third of the CMIP6 data request. This is to really try and restrain that resource requirement that we're asking from modeling centers. This number is just a ballpark, it's just an estimate. We want that number to be ultimately facilitated through that community process. Cool. Next slide, please. Some of the scope of what this harmonized data request layer is going to be covering. The primary use, of course, number one is data requested from the fast track experiments to support the AR7 process. That's really what the fast track is about. That's the timeline that we're working to. That's our highest priority. It's making sure that the variables that are needed to facilitate the AR7 analyses are produced in the AR7 fast track. We also want to consider data from those fast track experiments that might be used for later analysis or for a subsequent analysis. We know from surveys that we've already put out that not all modeling centers are going to want to repeat the fast track experiments in the future. And so we want to have a mind onto not just what's required for AR7, but what is going to be required by MIPS and by the scientific community from these fast track experiments outside of necessarily the AR7 process. We're also going to be looking at MIP experiments that are looking to operate on a CMIP7, an AR7 type timeline, so quite AR7 timeline, but aren't necessarily in the fast track. And then obviously number 4 is kind of filling in that gap as well. So data from MIP experiments for subsequent analysis that might not necessarily be on the AR7. I think this is really an order of priority here as far as these requirements goes. We really need to, at minimum, facilitate the AR7 process, but we also want to try and get this data request as robust as possible for the simulations that are going to be done over the next few years. The discussions that we're hoping to facilitate through these thematic processes is sort of a few different aspects to harmonization. There's scientific harmonization, making sure that the scientific objectives are being met in a consistent approach, a consistent way. We're talking with modeling benchmarking and understanding what's required for common analyses on the scientific front. On the technical side of things, we're looking to improve the consistency that we have with CF metadata, the CF conventions. Martin did an amazing job in CMIP6 getting the data request as aligned as possible to CF conventions. And we're hoping that through this process, especially of a large cull of the CMIP6 data request, that we can increase to ideally 100% alignment between what's in the data request and what is in the CF conventions, including suggesting new standard names and things like that if we need to. We've kind of got also scope harmonization. So we're talking about making sure that the sampling is consistent, the masking is applied consistently across the variables. We've got a common approach to how many pressure levels and what kind of temporal sampling we have, and then capacity harmonization. So that sort of tension between the demand and the resources of modeling centers to actually submit variables. One of the challenges with using CMIP data, as I'm sure many people know, is you want a variable, or you want a set of variables, but there's a small number of models who've actually completed that full set of variables that you need for your analysis. So really trying to shrink down the list of variables so that we have the highest interoperability across the archive as possible. All right, next slide. I'll take a sip of water. As I said, the impact and adaptation theme is well underway. This is just a bit of a little teaser of what they've been working on, trying to conceptualize where the data is going to be used and how they want to facilitate choosing variables to facilitate what they understand the data uses of. So they're really trying to map out which sectors use CMIP data and trying to sort of trace it back to these are the variables that we need to facilitate those different kinds of analysis, which is really exciting to see. Moving on. So I'm just going to describe just a little bit about the actual data request structure. This component, the mapping between variables and experiments was quite complex and not very awfully transparent in CMIP6. Martin did an excellent job getting it done. And this process that we're going through at the moment is giving us a really good opportunity to simplify that and increase the transparency around that. We learned from CMIP6 surveys that the prioritization, there was a priority metadata attribute in the data request between 1 and 3, but it wasn't really well understood what 1 meant and who was asking for what variable for what purpose. You kind of just put in an experiment and the MIPS that you were subscribed to, and it kind of just and you got a list of variables, which was enough to produce those variables, but it didn't facilitate a high level of community understanding of why they were being requested, so that modeling centers can then make informed decisions about not only which variables they prioritize and produce, but an eye to consistency for when consistency is needed. That's going to be around variable groups. You know, we might be talking radiation balance variables, might be a single variable group. These are non-exclusive, so a variable will exist in multiple groups. Those variable groups are really there for facilitating that mapping in a way that is easily transparent and at a granularity that people can engage with. It's really difficult to kind of look at a 2,000 item long list of variables and try to understand how the decisions were made. Part of these groupings that we're talking about here are to facilitate that understanding. So we might have variable groups like radiation balance and ocean heat balance, and then might have an opportunity that collects some of those up into an eye towards how the data is being used. So those variable groups might be more around the actual sort of physical, what are those variables capturing and what kind of core analysis happens, whereas that opportunity might be benchmarking models against each other. You know, if you want to benchmark models against each other, you need to be able to analyze heat balance of the ocean and radiation balance at the top of the atmosphere. So that's kind of the idea here. We're going to group experiments together as well. That's probably less of a difficult thing for us to go into. There's only a relatively small number of experiments in the fast track compared to CMIP6. But we wanted to have something at a similar level of granularity than to the variable groups, so that a single opportunity will have variable groups assigned to it and experiment groups assigned to it. I will move on from that one. How are we actually going about collecting this information, you might ask, which we did. So we're going to be using Airtable to do this, a lot of this work through. Airtables is really helping us balance between the need to have complex databases with robust associations between metadata that we use in the current CMIP, the CMIP6 data request was a database, an XML database, and what the Airtable also does is allows a high level of transparency. People can access that and really search through and understand the connections and associations in quite a transparent way. We can also collect information through Airtable really well. The IPO has been using Airtable now for probably about a year and a half, and have gotten very good at they're using it for surveys, they're using it to collect data and capture database information. It's a really flexible tool that we're going to be trying to utilize as much as possible in order to capture these requests and requirements from the community and from the thematic teams themselves. And we're going to be constructing the data request inside Airtable with the thematic author teams feeding into that process. We're going to, that's sort of, just go back for a second, sorry. That's to actually collect information about the variables. As well, we also want to have capture information about the discussion and the commentary on the variables that is taking place. We don't want that to only happen we don't want to only see the results. We want to be able to capture that discussion. We're going to be linking that, hopefully integrating that with Airtable. We're still working on the details here, but we're looking at integrations between Airtable and GitHub so that we can capture specific conversations about specific variables in sort of a GitHub issue style way. All right, let's go. This is just a bit of sort of stitching all of this together. How will this actually work? On the very left, we've got integrating activities. So we've got the steering groups of the thematic paper processes. We've got the data request task team. We've got 3 co-chairs, and we've got the task team with about 10 to 15 members. I think there's 13 last time I checked. We've got within the data request task team, we've got a CF metadata working group. We've also got the Fresh Eyes on CMIP group. We have a subset of the Fresh Eyes on CMIP working with the data request, and we've requested them to sit inside these thematic papers in order to try and give us just an extra set of eyes onto that harmonization process. So we've got quite a lot of sort of governance groups asking the big questions and linking everything together. The thematic papers will do the core of that defining of what the variables are under these 5 themes that we've described. The harmonization process will ultimately feed into a curated data request database that's likely to be in some kind of in CMIP6 it was XML. I'm not really sure exactly what Airtable functions on at its core, but we'll be producing a database that people can interact with, so Python scripts and Python API in order to input directly into it as well. As in CMIP6, we also fed out into the CMOR, what was it, the MIP, was the CMOR tables, Martin? CMOR tables, I think, was that what it was called? And those vocabularies, so in that in the JSON format that you might be very familiar with. There was also a web interface that captured all of this information. So we'll be looking to do that as well. So really taking the core of that data request, mapping and definitions, and sort of exporting that into as many different accessible ways of interaction. I know that I bounced very much heavily between the MIP tables, using the Python library to interact with it, going to the web interface to look up details. I used all of those. So it'd be good to sort of maintain those.